Okay, so welcome to our podcast, Her Body and Mind. My name's Amanda Sarge, clinical counselor, and this is
Dr. Sierra Fox.
And today we're going to talk about grief in the trauma healing space. So this is something that often surprises my clients. It's something I don't think there's a ton of information out there on about how when you go to therapy and you show up to do your trauma work, how grief is often a huge, huge part of that. So today we're going to talk about like what is grief in the trauma healing space, why it shows up, how long it lasts, and how do we turn towards that and work with that in a way that's going to help us move through it.
Okay, very good. So why don't we get started? Why don't you share with us what is grief in the trauma healing space?
Yeah. So, I mean, grief is an emotional response to loss. I think grief has touched most human beings in one way or another. And so when we talk about grief, I think it's this, in some ways, universal experience that human beings, I think, is so uniquely human that we can all kind of resonate with. But grief in itself is such a massive topic. Like there's so much to talk about when it comes to grief.
Yeah.
But I think the idea in grief is that in trauma, our nervous system didn't have the opportunity to grieve. So it's held back because we are too busy surviving to grieve. And so once you step into a trauma space and you start to lessen those trauma reactions through good trauma therapy, grief is just waiting in the wings. And that is a really hard part of this work, a really hard part to work that's already really hard.
Got you.
Right?
So that kind of, I think, answers my next question maybe, but you can expand if you feel like there's more. So why does grief show up after trauma healing? So you kind of did just touch on that.
There's a lot to, So I think when we look at like grief, what it is, I think we can all know what it is, but grief in itself is this complicated, like many, many emotions at one time. So grief can be sadness, anger, longing, like disorientation, relief, like all of that is grief. And those things still show up in the trauma space.
Yeah.
And so, like I've already kind of alluded to, grief gets postponed.
Yeah. There's like no space for it.
No.
You're just like, that's not the priority. Survival is the priority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing with trauma survivors is that, and we talked about this in our What is Trauma episode, is that trauma is a lot about avoidance. And when we're in trauma, avoiding our internal symptoms and external reminders of our triggers is so, so critical.
To survive.
Like we had to. And I think once we start to lessen that, then we can start to feel the grief. And the grief in the trauma space is different because we're not losing something in real time. So when someone we love dies, or we grieve in lots of ways, we move or we lose a friend, or like there's so many ways to grieve.
Yeah.
But in the trauma space, what comes up is like we're grieving the childhood we should have had.
Yeah.
Or we're grieving for sexual abuse. We're grieving like the innocence of our younger self.
Yep.
We're grieving protection that we never had. Parents that should have been different. And this is a big one because people show up and they often didn't quite realize like how bad it was until we start to unpack it.
Yeah.
And so again, avoidance, we tell ourselves childhood was fine. My parents were good.
Yeah.
And as you start to pull it apart, especially with like big T, like serious, like sexual abuse, mental, emotional, physical abuse, that protection piece is a really hard thing to grieve.
Yeah.
Like, why wasn't I protected? So that's pretty huge.
Yeah. I would say what comes to mind for me, I'm trying to draw on like, what is the most recent experience I've had with like grief? And as you were saying all that, I feel like I went through something similar with my ADHD diagnosis and then being like, just grieving my whole life.
Yes.
Like no joke like that.
Yes.
It literally, I was like, it was like a loss. Like I had to be like, all this time I wasn't supported. And like, what would my life have been like had I had this support and had people around me understood that of me? You know what I mean? There's just like, there's so many pieces where you just like rewind. I was like, oh my gosh.
And that's so much what people say, right? Like, and it's this it's quite a profound thing.
Yeah.
And I think when people come to trauma therapy, they come to reduce symptoms. So they're showing up to reduce hypervigilance. They're showing up to reduce anxiety, to feel better. And once that starts to happen, though, for some people, it's quite a profound sense of grief. And that's hard. Really good. Grief is really good, but it's really hard because your life would have been different had you not been sexually abused, had you not been raised in a home with an alcoholic, had you not been all of the other billion ways one can be traumatized.
Yeah.
And I think this is so important because it's hard, like at the onset of therapy, for me to explain to people, you might feel really, really terrible after, and you might have a lot of grief work. Like I can say that when we talk about risks of trauma therapy, but I think this is something that occurs. I think another why in the grief space with trauma is that when we look at the way we avoid by like numbing, minimizing, and blaming ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's not conducive to grief work either. Right. So that's like one of those barriers that like stops
You can't
us.
grieve if you're stuck in that.
No.
Because you're not acknowledging what happened.
No, you can't grieve what you don't feel.
Yeah.
And I think that clients are surprised by this. Like they're like, I was supposed to feel better, but now I feel terrible.
Yeah. Is actually a disclaimer that you probably have to say is like, just by the way, once we have like, you figure this out, you're probably going to feel a lot worse, which is crappy.
Yeah.
Really though.
It is crappy.
So that kind of then with the next question would be, how do clients respond to this? So how do they respond to then the grieving process?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not well.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
I mean, I think the biggest thing here, and I say this all the time in therapy, is like grief isn't a regression. Grief is indicative of integration. And so integration is that beautiful trauma word that we use when we talk about like we've integrated the trauma, like we've integrated. It's no longer just sort of stuck there, untime stamped, ready to hijack us at any moment.
Right.
And so when grief starts to set in and people are like, I'm feeling really sad for this like little girl who should have been treated better. Inside, I'm like, yes. Right? I always say in therapy, I'm like, I sound like such a psycho. Because when people are like, I feel terrible, I'm like, this is good. Yes. Because it's so important. So yeah, grief feels here like you're falling apart, but like you're actually coming together.
Yeah.
And maybe for the first time.
Yep. And
Which
that's
is so beautiful.
very hard for someone who's avoidant to understand because you spent your whole life avoiding emotions and not feeling anything.
And I think how clients respond to this is varied. And I think that's why it's so important to be in a therapeutic space that is like for your practitioner to be skilled enough to manage this.
Yes.
Because grief is, I think it's like this first opportunity almost because it comes pretty quick after. So you go through the traumatic memory, say it's early childhood, some type of violence or sexual abuse, get through the really, really hard, which is coming to terms with those traumatic memories, EMDR, working through them.
Yeah.
And then it can be pretty quick. Grief's just there now, open. And it's sort of this like first opportunity for a trauma survivor. If you've lived your whole life with trauma,
Yeah.
it's a first opportunity to like turn towards it without dysregulation, dissociation. Your nervous system isn't on fire in the same way. And so it's this really cool.
If you get taught how to go through that properly, but if not, then I feel like it would be really not cool.
No. And so that's why it's like, that's part of the therapy is
Yeah.
once that grief shows up, as it often does, it's learning that this is like sort of a first opportunity to turn towards an internal state that feels hard, but without that like nervous system on fire. And it's not like because you've done this trauma work, all of those old adaptive coping mechanisms are just gone.
No.
But it's slowly and titratedly, you can learn to turn towards that pain and like grieve that childhood that you never had in a way that actually just so beautifully facilitates all the work that you've been doing in therapy.
Totally.
So clients respond not well, but once we're moving through it, better.
This is very interesting. So I have a real experience with a patient this last week that like, I thought at first, like the state that she came into my office was because her counselor didn't do like the container with her at the end of their session. So they decided after whatever, they're going to start doing EMDR and processing childhood stuff, which they never had.
Yeah.
So then she comes into my office and I probably never seen her just look so there's a look. There's just like, you're just heavy, so many different emotions. You can just see they're like wearing everything. Everything was out in the open. And then I just kind of went through, she's like, I can't sleep. I'm not eating. I'm so unwell. Like, what can we do? Like, she was very dysregulated. So going back, I'm like, okay, well, what happened in your counseling session? She's like, oh, well, we did start to do EMDR. And I'm like, okay, like, did they do the container stuff where you like put everything back into a box? Like, do you have a container? Like, just went through that. Yeah. She's like, no. Oh. So they did not do that. But hearing this, then I saw her again. And then she went through with her counselor about doing the container and closing properly. But still, she was in this kind of state, like a bit better, but not quite. Yep. And I'm like, why? Like, if they did that, why is she still here? She was probably like 20-30% better, but still kind of there. And this is that. I feel like this is that. It's like acknowledging that this thing happened. So now it's out in the open, but then having to like grieve it.
Yeah. I mean,
part of it anyways, I was just like, I don't know everything. I knew enough to ask about the container. That's as far as you need to go do that.
Put it in a box.
Go put it in a box.
And I think that's so like good you bring that up, because I think that's trauma work. And when you're in the thick of trauma work, I mean, the therapist should have had a container, but even with the best containment, it's open, and it is such a difficult time. Like if you have a lot of trauma, sometimes like months of being raw. And so when we talked about trauma, it's like, how do we stabilize people enough to have the strength to go into this space? Yeah. Because that could have been the grief part, but that could have just been your trauma's open and you're coming to terms with like big T terrible memories. And it is a hard go, but still so worth it, because that is still better than living with trauma for the rest of your life. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. It's not tricky. To scare it. Like, I think I don't want to scare people to be like, well, I can't handle that. I think when done properly, it is hard, but we work to make sure people have the resources to handle the hard, which for a lot of people does come, right? It is hard. I think a point about grief that I just want to touch on in terms of how clients respond is when you have been like taught by your circumstance to be avoidant. Grief that's avoided does, and this is true for all grief, whether it's like grief of a loved one, grief of like your like innocence, grief that's avoided becomes complicated grief. And so complicated grief is what we don't want for people in any grief space. And so unprocessed grief turns out to be anxiety, anger, shutdown, dissociation, needing control.
That's complicated grief.
Yes.
Okay.
And so avoided grief becomes complicated symptoms, but attuned grief, when we turn towards it, softens the nervous system. It becomes healing. It becomes calmer. It becomes regulated. It becomes an invitation for a different part of ourself. Because grief is different than trauma. Trauma we can heal for in a lot of ways. Grief isn't like this thing that we treat and then it's done. Grief changes us, and grief will stay in a different type of way. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So it's this idea of turning towards it instead of away from it, and knowing that turning away from it does have some like consequences.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
I like the soft.
Yeah, the
grief.
soft is good.
That sounds nice.
But it's hard to get there because you gotta turn towards the grief.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, now next question. As far as time, are we able to quantify like how long will this grief last? Like if someone's like, well, if I'm going to go through this, like how long will I have to suffer?
Yes. People ask me that all the time. And my answer is not comforting. So I think the thing with grief, and all grief, whether it's grief of a loved one, grief of your childhood, there isn't a universal timestamp. And that's what makes grief so interesting to study, to experience, is that so many other things, if we look at PTSD or CPTSD, there's a lot of research that we can put people into this place to be like, this is very typical. Yeah. The word typical in grief, it like doesn't really exist because there isn't a typical. So if we're talking about grief of a loved one, so if your child or spouse or a close parent dies, early grief can be up to 2 years. And people don't realize that. So people will be like, it's been 6 months. And I'm like, Yeah, that's not long in the grief world for like a deep, profound loss. Not always. Some people it's shorter. Some people have moved through that kind of grief stage quicker. But with this type of grief, I think it is so varied. And I think there isn't an answer. I don't find it goes on for years and years and years,
Like
and
forever.
Years. No.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is that it has to be felt. And so my best analogy I always use in my office for grief is like if there's a stove here and if I accidentally touch the stove, my like first instinct is to what?
Pull away.
Right?
Yeah.
Grief's the same. It is painful and terrible, but and we have the same automatic reaction to pain because we like to self
Get me out of here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I say to people is like, you have to put your hand there. You have to feel it. You have to keep it there. And unlike an actual flame, which will be bad, don't do that. But if it's grief, it does lessen. And so like grief is decreased with connection to it. And so, yeah, it doesn't go away fully.
Roger.
Okay.
So how does one go about grief work?
Yeah. This is also really varied. I think first is naming it because I think if you're a trauma survivor, a lot of those grief symptoms feel similar to your trauma symptoms, which feels very scary. You've spent your whole life and very adaptively so being like, I'm avoiding all of my emotions. Right. And so turning towards it starts with first like good psychoeducation about what you're experiencing.
Yep.
So saying like, this is grief. Okay. This is grief. How do I turn towards this? I think also knowing kind of circling back to the time piece is really important because knowing that this like will not last forever, but I'm also not expecting this to fully go away. Like another like analogy is if we think of like a piece of paper and we think of like a ball in the middle. Okay. See if I can
piece of paper and a ball, like a drawing.
Yeah. So it's like a piece of paper and then I'm going to draw a circle that's going to be like the full inside of that square. So that's initial grief, especially if you've like lost someone you've loved. And what happens is there's no real moving around because everywhere you move, you hit it. Like you wake up, you hit it. You get out of bed, you hit it. Like you're constantly hitting this giant ball of grief. And what happens as we turn towards it and we feel it and we do our grief work, which I'm going to talk about in 30 seconds, it shrinks. And so there's a bit more room to move around the grief. And then as time goes on, we keep turning towards it. It shrinks, which I think where some of that like time heals all, which is totally false, comes from is that time does help grief, unlike trauma, but it never fully leaves. And so we have still a little circle in our big square of life and a song, or sometimes like,
it's like a reminder of,
sometimes people don't have kids yet and then they've done their trauma work and then they have a kid who becomes the 6-year-old and that was how old they were when they were sexually abused. And that little face of that little girl, you hit your own grief, right? In a way that is okay, but hard. So that grief piece doesn't leave, but it can become very manageable.
Yeah.
And how we turn towards that is like titration.
Explain that.
So like, we don't just say, okay, I want you to go home and like, just like be in this, like wake up in this, sit in it.
Oh, it's like small exposures that get like, I get it. Okay.
So, and that is, I mean, trauma survivors like control. So I'm encourage people to do time periods of grief work. So I'll say 15 minutes twice a week. I want you to turn towards this feeling.
Yeah.
How we turn towards it. People are always like, what do you mean by that? Anything. So I really like stream of conscious journaling, which is different than like journaling in that you just write and you write whatever comes up. So you put a pen to a piece of paper and unless you're like house is on fire, you don't stop writing for like, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
It's like really beautiful what can come out.
Okay.
And it's really helpful for therapy because it's like, this came up and it's like,
right.
Oh, amazing. Eliciting sadness is another way. So listening to a sad song and letting yourself feel it.
Yeah. You're just like letting it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Body work, breath work, sitting in it, connection.
Mm-hmm.
So talking to people who are like, who you trust, which is a hard one because humans respond generally terribly to grief. And so it's really hard to actually find someone in your life. And this is very true for real profound grief when someone's died. The biggest thing I hear all the time is like, everyone in my life is letting me down because no one knows how to respond to grief.
Right.
And so although connection can be really beautiful in a grief space, it is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's turning towards it, which is really hard and feels abstract because with grief, it is abstract and it has to be learning to connect to your own internal world in a way that you might have never done before. And part of this is figuring out what that's going to be for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, kind of the last question is like barriers, which I think you've actually brought up a few of the barriers with this process.
Yeah.
Like grieving process.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many barriers. I've talked about it this whole time, but I think the biggest barrier is those protective parts. So trauma survivors are really good at telling themselves that they're overreacting.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they're survivors of domestic violence.
Yeah. It's like they're the problem. It's they're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So allowing yourself to turn towards like a pretty big feeling and not minimizing it by telling yourself that you're being like dramatic is a huge barrier.
Totally.
Feeling your feelings.
Yeah.
Huge barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Actually having a safe space at home to be able to do this can be a barrier too.
Yeah.
Like we talk about women, like we've talked about perimenopause and iron and all of the like things that happen for women. Having a space, if you have kids and you have a busy life and you're working and you're doing these things, you're already giving a lot of your time, like maybe once a week to sit in a therapist's office. Then at home, time where you can let yourself kind of be emotional, fall apart, hit the floor. That's actually a huge barrier for women.
Yeah.
So something about the shower tends to be a nice safe space for people. The steam, it's like a private space where people tend not to just interrupt you.
Okay.
I think it just kind of naturally happens for people. People do a lot of grief work in the shower.
Okay.
So I off like, especially if it's a really busy woman, I'll just be like, can you have a shower? And then, you know, the door is locked and just even 10 minutes there, going for a walk and kind of letting yourself cry. But that's hard too. Because like people are seeing you crying. That's not fun.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real reality for, I think, all humans, but particularly women, because like, you can't even go to the bathroom. Your kids are like banging on, mom, I'm grieving.
You shall not grieve. Not today.
Not today, children. So yeah, it's really actually a really hard thing to do. And I think the words that I get people to say is like, this is not dramatic, or this is not bad, or this is not unsafe.
Yeah.
It's that internal work of like, I'm safe enough to do this now.
Mm-hmm.
Let me like explore what it feels like to feel my feelings.
Yeah.
And trauma survivors have often never done that.
Truth.
Because it's not safe.
For a reason. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So that's grief and trauma work. A quick like overview, obviously, but I think it's so important to talk about, because even if you're not in therapy and you're doing some of your own work and all of a sudden you feel really sad, it's like, what's going on? It's not bad. It's so good. It's so healing.
Right. So don't slam on the brakes if that happens.
No, be kind to yourself.
There you go.
You're not getting worse. You're getting better.
That's hopeful. That's
That
good.
is hopeful.
Very good. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you have any other kind of questions, comments, any of that about?
Actually, one came up because I feel like there's this very old school train of thought about like the 6 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And because I think maybe that's probably what I was taught.
Yeah, that's what we were all taught.
So is that a thing?
It's very much debunked in the research. Not a thing.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
But it was a thing. And I think that the thing with grief, I love that you bring that up, is because everyone thinks they're doing it wrong. So I work a lot with grief, not just in the traumatic space, but when people lose their spouse, their child, their job, there's so many layers and complicated grief realities for humans. Because of that stage of model, that whatever.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks they're doing it wrong. And I think those stages,
Yeah, you like have to go through it in this very specific way. I'm like, how is that even human? Like, I don't get it.
Not. Yeah,
It's very weird.
Those stages can exist, right?
Yeah.
So denial, bargaining, depression, all of the stages exist,
Yeah.
but
Not in that order.
No.
Oh,
And you can jump forward and then jump back.
yeah.
So that freaks people out too, because they're like, I thought I was done.
I'll just stick to the plan here.
But now I'm back to denial and I don't think it's real. And I keep calling my deceased husband, but oh yeah, he's dead. Like, it's really tricky.
Got you.
So what I always say to people though, and this is true in the trauma space as well, this is really important, is that the end goal is always the same. So no matter what your grief is, no matter what stages and phases it takes to get there, the end goal is always acceptance.
Got you.
So acceptance of what was and not acceptance of bad behavior. So even when we talk about grief or we talk about, this word is tricky in trauma space, but forgiveness. Forgiveness is giving up hope of a different yesterday.
Right.
It's not condoning a terrible treatment of your body, mind, soul, spirit. It's giving up hope of a different yesterday and accepting that was your reality and then moving forward.
It's not forgiving the person that did the bad thing. It's like, yeah, I get you.
And that gets complicated when we talk about like different faith-based perspectives. And it's kind of a very murky water when that word forgiveness is thrown into trauma work.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about grief, we do need, for our own sense of self, I think is critical for healing, is an acceptance of what was.
Yes.
And I don't know how people can, especially because I sit in this all day with people, how can you get to a space of acceptance of the thing that happened to you if you cannot grieve the reality of what you lost in that experience?
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes, excellent question.
Thank you. Came with it by myself.
Wow. Yeah. So it's good. Lots of different parts we could talk about here, but I think that's an overview of grief.
Yeah.
So yeah, if there is any questions you have about this, because I think that this might ring true, or we hope it rings true for some listeners.
Yeah.
Right questions, I will answer them to the best of my ability. You can answer them if something comes up that fits your wheelhouse as well. Next week, we're going to do a 2-part series on something that actually goes really well with this, because we're going to talk about internal family systems.
Fun.
Yeah, which is parts work. And so when we talk about barriers to grief in the traumatic space or traumatic healing space, that's a huge part of it, is that our parts, the parts of us that have been taught not to feel anything, get really good at protecting us. So now I'm your therapist and I'm like, I want you to grieve. And then those parts are like, the hell we're doing that. So learning that language of parts work, internal family systems is what we're going to talk about next time.
Fun times.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, that's it. That's all.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah. We'll see you next week.